Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. It was a quiet spring evening in Baltimore, Maryland. April 2006. The kind of night where the air smells like rain that hasn't fallen yet. The streets were calm. The harbor reflected the city lights in long, broken ribbons across the water. Families were inside. Couples were settled in for the evening. The city was doing what cities do at night, breathing slowly, moving quietly, keeping its secrets close. Ray Rivera kissed his wife Allison goodbye and walked out the front door. He never came back. At first, Allison wasn't alarmed. Ray was a busy man. He had work projects, calls to make, people to meet. He sometimes ran late. She knew his rhythms the way only someone deeply in love knows another person's rhythms. By feel, by instinct, by years of paying attention to someone you've chosen to share your life with. But as the evening stretched on and the hours kept accumulating with no word, no call, no text, that feeling began to change. Small at first, a tightening in the chest. A glance at the clock that becomes a stare. A phone call that goes to voicemail once, then twice, then again. By morning, Rivera had not come home. By morning, something was very wrong. And it would be 11 days before anyone would find him. Raymond Arthur Rivera Jr. was born on February 10, 1974, in California. He was by every account from every person who ever knew him. One of those rare human beings who made the world feel a little warmer just by being in it. Not because he was loud or flashy or performed his kindness for an audience, but because he was genuine, deeply, quietly, consistently genuine. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with an easy smile and the kind of calm physical confidence that comes from someone who is comfortable in his own skin. He played volleyball. He loved film. He had a mind that worked quickly and a heart that worked just as fast. His friends describe a man who remembered things, who showed up, who listened. Really listened when you were talking to him. In a world that increasingly rewards the appearance of attention over the real thing, Ray Rivera gave people the real thing. Every time. He met Allison in California, and from the very beginning, people who saw them together said the same thing: those two are something special. They had the kind of relationship that doesn't need to announce itself. It was visible in the small things, the way they looked at each other across a room, the way they finished each other's sentences without trying to, the way they moved through the world, as though being together was simply the most natural thing in the universe. They married. They were happy, genuinely, visibly, abundantly happy. Ray had spent years building a career in film production, developing his craft, sharpening his skills, doing the slow, unglamorous work of becoming truly good at something creative. He had talent that other professionals in the industry recognized and respected. He had a future in it, a real future. And then came the opportunity in Baltimore. Ray's close friend Porter Stansberry ran a financial publishing company called Stansberry Research, one of the most widely read investment newsletter businesses in the country. Porter and Ray had known each other for years. Their friendship was real and their mutual respect was genuine. When Porter's company began expanding into video content, Ray was the obvious choice. The right choice. Someone Porter trusted with the work and with the company's image. And so Ray and Allison made the decision. They left California. They packed their lives into boxes and pointed themselves east, and they moved to Baltimore together, full of the particular excitement that comes from leaping toward something new. They arrived with hope, with energy. Ray threw himself into the work. Colleagues liked him immediately. He was professional and creative and easy to work alongside. He and Porter continued to be close. The future from the outside looked bright, and for a while it was, for a while. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be, but something was moving beneath the surface. Something that Ray, with his particular quality of attention, that rare, genuine alertness to the world around him, may have begun to notice. Something that in the end may have cost him everything. In the days and weeks before April 14, 2006, Ray Rivera appeared, to most people who saw him, to be himself. Going to work, coming home to Allison, living the life they had built together in their new city. But there were small things, tiny, Easy to miss things that only become visible in hindsight. Colleagues noted that in the final days before he disappeared, Ray had seemed slightly more preoccupied than usual. Not distressed exactly. Not frightened in any obvious way. But somewhere inside himself in a manner that was just slightly different from his usual open, present way of moving through the world. He had been working on a project, something more involved than the routine video content he typically produced. The exact nature of that project has never been fully confirmed publicly, but people who were around him in those final days sensed that whatever he was working on carried more weight than usual. There were phone calls. There were late hours. There were moments where Ray seemed to be carrying something, some thought, some knowledge, some concern, that he had not yet put into words for the people closest to him. Allison, who knew him better than anyone, sensed something but could not name it. Later, she would describe those final days as ordinary on the surface, and quietly tense underneath. Like weather that looks clear but feels like a storm is building somewhere just out of sight. On the evening of April 14th, Ray left the apartment. He was wearing casual clothes, flip-flops on his feet. He had his phone. He did not tell Allison where he was going. Or if he did, it was something ordinary, something that didn't warrant a second thought. A quick errand, a short trip. The kind of thing you say when you expect to be back in an hour. He left. The door closed behind him. And somewhere in the city of Baltimore, in the spring darkness, something happened to Ray Rivera. Something that ended with a hole in a wall. Something that ended in a locked basement room inside one of the most beautiful and historic buildings in the city. Something that 18 years later still does not have a satisfying answer. The Belvedere Hotel stands at the corner of Charles and Chase Streets in Baltimore's Manin neighborhood. It has stood there since 1903. 13 stories of Beaux Arts grandeur, ornate stonework, elegant archways, the particular beauty of a building that was designed to impress and has never stopped doing so. It has hosted presidents. Woodrow Wilson stayed there. F. Scott Fitzgerald drank in its bars. For decades it was the most prestigious address in Baltimore, the place where the city's social life was lived at its highest register. Debutante balls, political dinners, grand celebrations. By 2006, the Belvedere had been converted into condominiums and mixed-use space. The grandeur remained the bones of the building, the history in its walls, but it was a residential building now, home to the people who lived inside its beautiful old frame. Ray Rivera had no known connection to the Belvedere. He didn't live there. He had no friends there that anyone could identify. He had no reason, as far as anyone could determine, to be inside that building. And yet on April 25, 2006, 11 days after he vanished, a maintenance worker at the Belvedere made a discovery in a small, seldom visited basement room, the body of a man, a hole with a wall. The hole was significant. It was not small. It was the kind of opening that suggests something came through it with force. Jagged around the edges, the wall material displaced inward. The hole opened from the direction of an adjacent parking garage. Specifically, from the direction of the parking structure that sat alongside the Belvedere. Ray Rivera was on the other side of that hole. His flip-flops were nearby, one on his foot, one some distance away. His phone was close to his body. He was wearing the same clothes he had left home in 11 days earlier. The room was locked. There was no obvious point of entry other than that hole in the wall. The medical examiner examined the body and determined that Ray Rivera's injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, specifically the kind of trauma consistent with a fall from a significant height, a fall from somewhere above. From the roof of the parking garage, most likely, the structure adjacent to the Belvedere, whose edge, at a certain point, aligned in a way that could, theoretically, result in a body coming through that wall. Could theoretically. Because here is where the geometry begins to fail. Here is where the story stops making clean, logical sense. For Ray to have fallen through that wall from the parking garage roof, the physics of it, the angle, the trajectory, the force required, raised serious questions. Questions about how a person in flip-flops ends up on a parking garage roof. Questions about the angle of entry through the wall. Questions about what someone falling accidentally, or jumping intentionally, or being pushed, would look like in terms of the resulting scene. The physical evidence was examined. Investigators looked at it carefully, and when the Baltimore Police Department reached their conclusion, they ruled Ray Rivera's death a suicide. Allison Rivera was devastated, not just by the loss, though the loss was incomprehensible, but by the ruling. Because the ruling she believed was wrong, and she said so, clearly, persistently, without ever wavering. She pointed to the flip-flops. Who leaves home to end their life in flip-flops, in casual clothes, with no note, no final message to the people they love? She pointed to Ray's state of mind. The people who had seen him in his final days described a man who was preoccupied, perhaps, but not despairing, not broken, not anywhere near the edge that a person must be standing on to make that choice. She pointed to the phone, to the unfinished text message found on that phone, a message that appeared to have been begun in urgency, addressed to Allison, and never completed, never sent. The kind of message that sounds less like a goodbye and more like a warning, or a call for help. She pointed to the scene itself, to the locked room, to the hole in the wall, to the strangeness of every single element of where Ray was found and how he was found there. None of it, she argued, was consistent with the story the ruling implied. None of it told the story of a man who had made a choice. It told the story, she believed, of something else entirely. The investigation that followed Ray Rivera's discovery was complicated from the beginning by the 11 days that had passed. The scene in that basement room had degraded. The trail, whatever trail had existed, had grown cold in ways that made certain kinds of forensic examination impossible or inconclusive. Investigators from the Baltimore Police Department worked the case. They examined the scene. They examined Ray's phone and the partial message on it. They spoke with Allison, with Porter Stansberry, with colleagues at Stansberry Research, with anyone who might have information about Ray's state of mind, or his whereabouts in the hours before he vanished. What they built was a picture, incomplete, frustratingly incomplete, of a man who had left his home on a spring evening and somehow ended up dead inside a historic hotel with no clear explanation of why he was there or what had happened to him. The suicide ruling, when it came, was based on the available evidence, the nature of the injuries, the absence of evidence pointing to another party, the lack of witnesses, the physical circumstances of the scene. But the absence of evidence pointing to another party is not the same as evidence of its absence. And Allison Rivera, and the many, many people who have since examined this case in detail, have argued that what was missing from the investigation was not evidence of foul play, but rather a thorough enough investigation to find it. There are specific questions that have never been adequately answered. The security footage from the Belvedere and the adjacent parking garage. What did it show? What time did the cameras capture? Were there any images of Ray Rivera approaching the building? And critically, were there images of anyone else? The access points to the parking garage roof. Who had access? Was it secured? How would a person in flip-flops in the dark have found their way there? The people in Ray's world in those final days. What exactly was he working on? Who had he spoken to? Who had he met with? Were there conversations, communications, interactions that pointed toward something, some conflict, some knowledge, some situation that had become dangerous? The unfinished text message. What did it say exactly? The full contents have never been made public. Why not? What would a complete accounting of those words tell us? These questions are not rhetorical. They are real. They are the questions that an investigation fully committed to the truth would have answered, or at least attempted to answer, before settling on a ruling. And for Allison Rivera, and for the community of people who have spent years examining this case, the fact that they have not been answered is itself significant. Now I want to talk about something that is important to understand in the context of this case. Something that adds a layer of complexity that, while not definitively connected to Ray Rivera's death, forms part of the world that he was living in. Porter Stansberry and Stansberry Research. I said this earlier and I'll say it again clearly. Porter Stansberry has never been charged with any crime related to Ray Rivera's death. He has cooperated with investigators. He has expressed grief over Ray's loss. He has not been identified as a suspect. But understanding Stansberry Research is important to understanding the world Ray was in. Stansberry Research in the mid-2000s was one of the largest and most controversial financial newsletter publishers in America. The company published investment research and advice through a subscription model, reaching hundreds of thousands of readers. Porter Stansberry himself was a charismatic, confident, deeply divisive figure, beloved by his subscribers and deeply criticized by his detractors. In 2003, the Securities and Exchange Commission began investigating Stansberry Research for fraud, specifically for a newsletter that the SEC alleged had published false information about a company in exchange for payment, without disclosing that payment to subscribers. It was a significant allegation, the kind that, in the financial world, carries serious consequences. The case wound through the legal system for years. In 2007, the year after Ray Rivera disappeared, a federal judge upheld the CC's findings and ordered Porter Stansberry to pay a civil penalty of approximately $1.5 million. Porter Stansberry denied wrongdoing. He appealed. He fought the ruling publicly and vocally. He maintained, as he has always maintained, that he was the victim of a government overreach targeting legitimate financial speech. The legal battle around Stansberry Research was ongoing and intense in the period that Ray Rivera was working there. And Ray, by virtue of his position, was adjacent to all of it. He was in the building. He was working with the people involved. He was producing content for a company that was, simultaneously, at the center of a significant federal investigation. Whether any of that matters to what happened to Ray on April 14, 2006, whether there is any connection between the legal and financial turbulence surrounding Stansberry Research and the death of the man who was one of Porter Stansberry's closest friends and professional collaborators, is something that has never been established, but it is part of the picture, and the picture matters. Let me tell you about the note, or rather, let me tell you about what some people have called the note, because calling it that may be giving it more definition than it actually has. Among the items examined by investigators in the wake of Ray Rivera's death was a piece of paper that was found in connection with Ray. The exact circumstances of where and how this paper was found have been reported inconsistently across different sources, and the full contents of what was written on it have never been publicly confirmed. What has been reported is that the paper contained writing that appeared to be in Ray's hand, and that the writing, whatever it said, in whatever form it took, was examined by investigators as potentially relevant to understanding Ray's state of mind in the period before his death. Some accounts suggest the writing was a list of names, people known to Ray, people connected to his work, people in the world of Stansberry Research. Other accounts describe it differently. What investigators made of it, and what weight it was given in the final ruling, is not entirely clear from the public record. But it exists, it was found, and it is one more piece of a puzzle that refuses to resolve into a clear image. Alison Rivera did not stop. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the aftermath of Ray's death. She did not accept the ruling. She did not put the case away. She did not allow the silence to settle over what happened to her husband. She pursued answers. She spoke publicly. She engaged with investigators. She connected with people who had expertise in forensic analysis and criminal investigation. She brought attention to the case in every way she could, and in doing so, she kept Ray's story alive. Because here is the truth about cases like this one: without someone to keep pushing, they disappear. The files get archived. The questions go unasked. The world moves on. Because the world always moves on, and the people who love the person who was lost are left behind with the weight of everything that was never resolved. Alison refused to let that happen. She has never stopped believing that Ray was killed. That something happened to him that night that was not of his own choosing, not the product of his own despair, but the result of something or someone outside of him. That her husband, her kind, creative, attentive, loving husband, did not choose to leave her. That he was taken. And she wants to know by what, and by whom. This is where we are at the end of our first chunk. Ray Rivera, 32 years old, gone from his home on a spring evening in Baltimore, found 11 days later in a locked basement room inside the Belvedere Hotel, through a hole in the wall, injuries consistent with a fall. The police ruled it suicide. His wife has never believed them. And the questions, the deep, persistent, quietly haunting questions remain. Baltimore does not give up its secrets easily. It is a city that has seen too much violence, too much silence, too much of the particular kind of pain that comes from questions left unanswered for too long. Its streets hold stories that were never told properly. Its buildings have witnessed things that were never fully investigated. And the people who move through it, who build their lives inside it, who love and work and dream inside it, sometimes disappear into it in ways that defy explanation. Ray Rivera disappeared into Baltimore on the night of April 4, 2006, and when he was found 11 days later, the city gave up just enough to confirm that something had happened, but not nearly enough to explain what. Now we go deeper. Let's talk about the Belvedere. Really talk about it. Because the building itself, its layout, its geography, its relationship to the structures around it, is essential to understanding why the official explanation of Ray Rivera's death has been so persistently, so powerfully contested. The Belvedere Hotel sits at the corner of Charles Street and Chase Street in Baltimore's Mount Vernon neighborhood. Mount Vernon is one of Baltimore's most historic and culturally significant districts, home to museums, galleries, grand townhouses, and the Washington Monument, the original one, the tall column that predates the more famous one in the nation's capital. It is a neighborhood of old money and old architecture, of wide sidewalks and ornate facades, and the particular quietness of a place that takes its own history seriously. The Belvedere rises 13 stories above this neighborhood. From the street, it commands attention. Even after a century, even after its conversion from hotel to condominiums, it retains the grandeur that its architects intended, the sense that this building was built to matter, to be seen, to endure. Adjacent to the Belvedere, connected to it in the way that urban buildings in dense city blocks are often connected, sharing walls or abutting structures, is a parking garage. A multi-level parking structure that serves the residents and visitors of the surrounding area. It is the relationship between this parking garage and the Belvedere that sits at the physical center of the mystery of Ray Rivera's death. The room where Ray was found was a basement, level room inside the Belvedere. A small room. Not a room that residents would have regular cause to visit. Not a room that appears prominently in the building's layout. A room that was, on the day Ray was found, locked. The hole in the wall of that room, the jagged, displaced opening through which Ray Rivera apparently came, faced in the direction of the parking garage. The hole was consistent in its physical characteristics, with something having come through it from the garage side. Not from inside the building outward, from outside inward. This is crucial. Read it again if you need to. The hole was made from the outside going in, from the parking garage side through the wall into the basement room of the Belvedere. For Ray Rivera to have ended up in that room through that hole, he would have had to come from the direction of the parking garage. He would have had to been traveling in the air in free fall, from somewhere above the level of that basement room, from somewhere on or above the parking structure, and he would have had to hit that wall with enough force to breach it, and his body would have had to come through the opening and land on the other side. Now, think about what that means physically. Think about the angle. Think about the trajectory. Think about what kind of fall, from what height, at what angle, with what force, would result in a human body breaching a wall and landing inside a room on the other side. Forensic experts and independent analysts who have examined the publicly available details of this case have raised significant questions about whether the physics of that scenario are consistent with a person jumping or falling from the roof of the parking garage voluntarily. The angle of entry through the wall suggests a trajectory that is, and this is the word that keeps coming up, difficult to account for. A straight fall from directly above the hole would not produce the kind of entry that was described. A person jumping from the roof of the garage, moving outward, away from the building, would not naturally describe the arc needed to come through that specific wall at that specific angle. So what does that leave? It leaves questions. Uncomfortable, insistent, geometry-based questions that the official suicide ruling does not satisfactorily address. And those questions are not coming only from Alison Rivera, though she has articulated them as clearly and as forcefully as anyone. They are coming from people with backgrounds in physics, in forensic analysis, in criminal investigation. People who looked at the publicly available details of this scene and found them, to use the most precise word available, inconsistent. Inconsistent with an accidental fall. Inconsistent with a voluntary jump. Inconsistent in certain important ways with the suicide determination. But consistent possibly, theoretically, chillingly, with something else. Let's talk about the flip-flops. It is a small detail. In the grand architecture of this case, a pair of flip-flops might seem like a minor thing, but details are never minor in a death investigation. Details are everything. Details are the language that evidence speaks in, and you have to be willing to listen. Ray Rivera was wearing flip-flops when he left his apartment on the night of April 14th. Casual, lightweight, the kind of footwear you put on when you're running a quick errand, when you're stepping out for a moment, when you fully expect to be back before long. Not the kind of footwear you choose when you're planning to go somewhere significant. Not the kind you put on when you're preparing for a final act. When Ray's body was found in that basement room, one flip-flop was on his foot. The other was found some distance away, not immediately adjacent to his body, but separated from it in a way that suggested something dynamic had happened. Movement. Force. Alison Rivera has pointed to the flip-flops repeatedly, and she is right to do so. Because the flip-flops speak to state of mind and to planning, or rather, to the absence of both. People who have decided to end their lives typically, not always, but typically, display some pattern of behavior that reflects that decision. A finality to their actions, a certain kind of deliberateness. Notes, goodbyes, an ordering of affairs, and in the absence of those things, at minimum, they tend to have chosen the moment and the method with some degree of intention. Ray Rivera showed none of those signs. No note was found, not a real one. Not a final communication to Alison, or his family or his friends that said what people say when they know they won't be coming back. No pattern of behavior in his final days consistent with someone approaching a decision like that. No conversations with the people closest to him that suggested he was in that kind of pain. And he left in flip-flops, for an errand, for a quick trip that he expected to return from. The flip-flops are not definitive proof of anything, but they are a data point. And in a case built on data points, in a case where the official ruling rests on an interpretation of physical evidence that many experts find questionable, every data point matters. Now let's talk about the phone. Ray's phone was found near his body in that basement room. It was examined by investigators, and on it they found something, a partial text message. A message that had been started, typed out at least in part, and then never finished. Never sent. The full contents of that message have never been made public. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of this case for everyone who has examined it, because the contents of that message could be enormously revealing. About Ray's state of mind in his final moments, about where he was and what was happening around him, about whether he was alone or not alone, about whether he was frightened. What has been reported, in fragments from sources familiar with the investigation, is this: the message appeared to be addressed to Alison, and its tone was not the tone of someone saying goodbye. It was not a farewell. It was something more urgent, something more immediate. Something that read, to those who described it, more like a warning or a cry for help than a final communication. Think about what that means. If Ray Rivera, in the last minutes of his life, was typing a message to his wife, not a goodbye, but something urgent, something that he did not have time to finish and send, what does that tell us about what was happening to him? It tells us that he was in a situation that developed quickly, that whatever happened in that final stretch of time happened fast enough that he could not complete a text message. It tells us that his mind in those final moments was on Alison, on reaching her, on communicating something to her that he believed she needed to know. It does not tell us the story of a man who had already made his peace with the world, who had already decided, who was in the quiet, terrible stillness that precedes a voluntary final act. It tells us the story of a man who was trying, who was reaching out, who wanted desperately to make contact with the person he loved, and who ran out of time. The investigation in the days immediately following Ray's discovery moved along the established tracks of such investigations: evidence collection, witness interviews, forensic examination, a reconstruction of the timeline. But the investigation was hampered from the start by that 11-day gap. 11 days between when Ray died and when he was found. 11 days during which the scene had been untouched, unexamined, degrading in the particular way that evidence degrades when it is exposed to time and temperature, and the slow passage of days without attention. The basement room was not climate controlled in the way that would have preserved evidence optimally. Whatever forensic traces might have existed in that room, traces that could have told investigators something about how Ray came to be there, about whether anyone else had been there with him, had degraded significantly by the time the room was opened. This is one of the central tragedies of the physical investigation. Not necessarily through anyone's fault, the room was not known to be a crime scene for 11 days, because Ray was not known to be inside it. But the result was that by the time investigators arrived, the best opportunity to gather certain kinds of evidence had already passed. What they had was the body, the hole in the wall, the phone, the flip-flops, the locked room, and a lot of questions. The Baltimore Police Department assigned investigators to the case. They worked it. They followed the available leads. They spoke to the people in Ray's life and tried to construct a picture of what had happened. But certain things about the official investigation have been criticized in the years since. Critics, including Alison Rivera, including independent forensic analysts, including journalists who have examined the case, have pointed to what they see as gaps, questions that were not adequately pursued, avenues that were not sufficiently explored. The security footage, for instance, the Belvedere and the adjacent parking garage were both equipped with security cameras. In a case like this, in a case where the exact circumstances of a man's presence in a building he had no known connection to are entirely unexplained, that footage should have been a priority. A central, critical piece of evidence. Was it examined? Yes, to some degree. But the full extent of what that footage showed, what cameras captured, what, at what times, whether Ray Rivera appeared on any of them, and if so, where and when, whether anyone else appeared alongside him or in proximity to him, has never been fully disclosed publicly. This absence of transparency is something that Alison Rivera has specifically pointed to. If the footage clearly supported the suicide determination, if it showed Ray Rivera alone, approaching the parking garage, ascending to the roof, with no one else present, why would that not have been disclosed? Why would that evidence not have been used to close the questions that kept being raised? The fact that the footage was not used in that way, the fact that its contents remain essentially unknown to the public, has fueled the persistent sense among those who follow this case that the footage contained something that complicated the picture. Or perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps there were dead angles. Perhaps the relevant areas were not covered by working cameras. But the absence of an answer is itself an answer of a kind. It is the answer that says we don't know. And we still don't know. Let's talk about the people in Ray's world. Because understanding who surrounded him, who was close to him, who had access to his life, who might have known what he was working on, or what he might have known, is essential to understanding the full scope of the investigation. At the center of Ray's professional world was Porter Stansberry. We've talked about Porter, about the friendship, about the professional relationship, about the legal turbulence that surrounded Stansberry research in that period. But let me add some texture to the picture. Porter Stansberry was not a simple figure. He was a man of enormous intelligence and enormous confidence, the kind of confidence that can look from the outside like either brilliance or arrogance, depending on your perspective. He was charismatic, he was driven. He had built something significant from the ground up, and he was fiercely protective of it. His relationship with Ray Rivera was, by all available accounts, genuine. Those who observed them together describe a real friendship, not just a professional arrangement, but the kind of bond between two people who genuinely liked and respected each other. Porter brought Ray to Baltimore because he trusted Ray, because Ray was someone he valued. When Ray disappeared, Porter was among those who helped organize the search. He reached out to contacts. He used his resources. By the accounts available, he behaved as someone who was genuinely alarmed and genuinely grieving. But Porter Stansberry's world, the specific ecosystem of Stansberry Research, the particular culture of high-stakes financial publishing, the web of relationships and interests and money that constituted that company and the people who moved through it, was not a simple world. It was a world where significant amounts of money were at stake, where information was currency, where the line between immediate financial research and something more legally fraught was, at times, contested, and Ray Rivera was embedded in that world. Not peripherally, centrally. He was one of Porter's most trusted collaborators. He was producing content that was core to the company's operations. He was, by virtue of his proximity to Porter and to the company's inner workings, in a position to know things. What things? This is where the record becomes genuinely murky. There have been suggestions, in interviews, in online discussions, in the accounts of people who were connected to the Stansberry world in that period, that Ray had become aware of something in the course of his work. Something that troubled him. Something that perhaps fell into legal or ethical gray area, or darker than gray. These suggestions have never been confirmed. They have never been tied to specific, verifiable evidence that has been made public. They exist in the space between rumor and allegation, significant enough to take seriously, unconfirmed enough that they cannot be stated as fact. But they are there. And in a case built on questions rather than answers, they matter. There were other people in Ray's orbit who were part of the Stansberry research world and who, by extension, became part of the investigation's landscape. Stansberry Research employed a number of people in various capacities: writers, analysts, editors, administrative staff. It was a substantial operation, and within that operation, there were relationships, some close, some complicated, some that involved the particular tensions that develop in high-pressure workplaces where money, ambition, and competition all converge. Investigators spoke with people from this world. They gathered impressions, accounts, information about Ray's recent behavior and state of mind. What emerged from those conversations, in the accounts available, was broadly consistent. Ray had been a positive, stable presence in the workplace. He had not been displaying signs of acute distress. He had been engaged in his work. But there were also, in some of those accounts, hints of something beneath that stable surface. Small observations. Things that taken individually would mean nothing, but that assembled together suggested that Ray Rivera had been carrying something in his final days. Something he hadn't shared widely. Something that was on his mind in a way that was different from his usual professional engagement. What that something was, whether it was connected to what happened to him, whether it mattered at all, remains unknown. There is another dimension to this case that I want to address carefully, because it has been a significant part of the public discussion around Ray Rivera's death. In the years following Ray's death, particularly as the internet enabled communities of people to research and discuss cold cases and unsolved mysteries with unprecedented depth and reach, the Ray Rivera case attracted significant attention. People who had no connection to Ray or to Baltimore or to Stansberry recent case and became invested in it, drawn in by its strangeness, by its unanswered questions, by the evident injustice of a ruling that seemed, to many observers, inadequately supported by the physical evidence. These communities, on forums, on Reddit, on true crime platforms, contributed something meaningful to the public understanding of the case. They identified details, they analyzed the physical evidence, they tracked down public records, they made connections that had not been widely reported. But they also, as online communities sometimes do, pursued threads that nowhere productive. They identified and discussed private individuals who had no provable connection to Ray's death. They speculated in ways that sometimes crossed the line from analysis into unfounded accusation. I want to be clear about the distinction here. Asking hard questions about an official ruling that appears to be physically inconsistent, that is legitimate. That is what Alison Rivera has been doing for years, and she is right to do it. Examining the forensic evidence, analyzing the geometry, pointing to the gaps in the investigation. All of that is legitimate and important, but identifying private individuals and attributing guilt to them without evidence, that is something else. And in a case as genuinely unresolved as this one, where the true circumstances of Ray Rivera's death remain unknown, it is important to hold the line between rigorous inquiry and unfounded accusation. What we know is that Ray Rivera died under circumstances that have not been adequately explained. What we do not know is who, if anyone, is responsible for his death, and until evidence emerges that changes that, the appropriate posture is questions, not conclusions. The months after Ray's death were, for Alison Rivera, a period of almost unimaginable difficulty. She was grieving, she was fighting. She was trying to hold together the remnants of the life she and Ray had built in Baltimore, while simultaneously pushing against an official ruling that she believed was wrong. She had lost not just her husband but the future they had been building together. The plans, the dreams, the ordinary, beautiful, irreplaceable texture of a shared life. She stayed in contact with investigators. She asked questions. She pushed for a more thorough examination of the evidence. She sought out independent experts who could assess the physical circumstances of Ray's death from outside the constrained official investigation. And she kept Ray present. In conversations, in public statements, in the way she spoke about him, with love and clarity and the particular precision of someone who refuses to let a person be reduced to a mystery. Ray Rivera was not just a cold case, he was a man, a husband, a creative, passionate, attentive human being who had deserved a long and full life, and had been deprived of it at 32 years old. Alison never let the world forget that. Let me tell you about something that happened in the investigation that has received less attention than the physical evidence but is in its way equally significant. The note, or more precisely, the document, the piece of writing found in connection with Ray, that investigators examined. I mentioned this in our first chunk, and I want to go deeper here, because what has been reported about this document is strange enough to warrant careful attention. What has been described, in various accounts, is a document that appeared to contain writing in Ray's hand. The writing, according to those accounts, included names, a list of names, people connected to Ray's world, people associated with Stansberry Research, people who moved in the same professional and social circles that Ray had inhabited in Baltimore. Now, a list of names means nothing by itself. People write lists of names for countless reasons. A contact list, a guest list, a list of colleagues or collaborators. Nothing about writing names on paper is inherently sinister, but context changes meaning. And in the context of everything else, in the context of a man who died under unexplained circumstances, whose death has been ruled suicide despite significant evidence questions, whose final text message suggested urgency and alarm, a list of names found in his possession takes on a different weight. What was the list for? Was it something Ray was compiling for professional purposes, a roster of contacts for a project? Was it something more personal, people he was thinking about, people he needed to reach, people he was trying to understand? Was it, as some have speculated, a list that had something to do with whatever Ray had become aware of in his final weeks? No one has publicly confirmed the answers to these questions. The document exists in the investigation record. It was examined, it was considered, but its significance, if any, to the official ruling has never been clearly explained. It is one more detail in a case full of details that don't resolve. One more thread that pulls and frays and doesn't lead to a clean end. By the time the Baltimore Police Department issued its final determination, suicide, the investigation had been ongoing for some months. The ruling, when it came, was not unexpected. It had been telegraphed in the general tenor of how investigators had publicly described the case. It was consistent with the medical examiner's findings about the nature of Ray's injuries. But it was not accepted universally, not by Alison, not by Ray's family, not by the growing community of people who had examined the case and found the physical evidence inconsistent with the conclusion. And crucially, it was not accepted by people who knew Ray, who had known him for years, who could speak to his character, his state of mind, his relationship to his own life. These people uniformly, by every available account, rejected the idea that Ray Rivera had chosen to end his life. They knew him. They knew how he felt about Allison, about his work, about his future. They knew the man who had left California with his wife and his dreams, and moved to a new city to build something better. That man, they said, did not jump off a parking garage. That man was taken. Here is what the official record says and what it does not say. It says Ray Rivera's injuries were consistent with a fall from height. It does not say we have established, beyond reasonable doubt, that the fall was voluntary. It says there was no physical evidence directly pointing to another party's involvement. It does not say, we thoroughly investigated all possible avenues and found no evidence of foul play. It says the ruling is suicide. It does not say we are certain. The gap between those statements, between what was found and what was concluded, is where the entire controversy lies. It is a gap wide enough to drive doubt through, and that doubt has never got away. Because reasonable doubt, not the legal standard but the human standard, the standard by which people who loved Ray Rivera, and people who have examined his case with clear eyes look at the evidence, and ask whether it supports the conclusion. That doubt is substantial. It is substantial because of the geometry. It is substantial because of the flip-flops. It is substantial because of the unfinished text message. It is substantial because of the locked room, and the hole in the wall, and the 11 days and the degraded evidence, and the security footage, whose contents have never been fully disclosed. It is substantial because of who Ray Rivera was, because of every account, from every person who knew him. That describes a man who had everything to live for and no discernible reason to choose otherwise. That doubt is Allison Rivera's inheritance from the official investigation. It is what she has been carrying ever since, and it is what has kept this case alive in the public consciousness for nearly 2 decades. In the years after Ray's death, Allison eventually left Baltimore. The city that had been supposed to be a new beginning had become the place where her world ended. She took with her the memories, the questions, and the determination that has defined her relationship to Ray's story ever since. She rebuilt. With enormous difficulty and enormous courage, she rebuilt. She found her way to a life that carried the weight of what happened but was not entirely consumed by it. She continued to advocate for Ray. She continued to push for answers. She continued to insist, in every conversation and every public statement, that her husband was not a suicide, that he deserved a full accounting of what happened to him, that the official ruling was wrong. And then, in 2022, something happened that brought Ray Rivera's story to an audience it had never reached before. A documentary series called Unsolved Mysteries. The revived Netflix version of the classic true crime television program dedicated an episode to Ray Rivera's case. The episode was called Death in Baltimore, and it brought the story of Ray Rivera, the Belvedere Hotel, the hole in the wall, the flip-flops, the unfinished text message, the contested suicide ruling, to millions of viewers worldwide. The response was extraordinary. The internet lit up. People who had never heard of Ray Rivera found themselves consumed by his story. The Reddit threads and forum discussions exploded with analysis, with theory, with the particular passionate engagement of people who encounter a mystery that genuinely cannot be explained away. Allison Rivera appeared in the documentary. She spoke about Ray, about who he was, about what their life together had been, about what she believed had happened to him. She was composed and clear and utterly convincing in her conviction. She did not perform grief. She simply told the truth as she understood it, and the truth she told resonated. It resonated because it was consistent, because it was supported by the evidence, because it did not require elaborate theorizing. It simply required looking at the physical facts of the case and acknowledging that they did not add up to the conclusion the official investigation had reached. The Unsolved Mysteries episode did not solve the case. It could not do that. But it did something important. It ensured that the case could not be quietly forgotten. It brought Ray Rivera back into public consciousness in a way that made the official suicide ruling harder to simply accept and move on from. And it put pressure, gentle, persistent, public pressure, on the questions that had never been answered. In the wake of the documentary, there was renewed discussion about whether the Baltimore Police Department might revisit the case, whether new evidence might surface, Whether the passage of time might loosen the grip of whoever or whatever was keeping the truth hidden, if indeed something was. The Baltimore Police Department, in public statements following the documentary's release, maintained their original determination. The case remained closed as far as they were concerned. The ruling of suicide stood. But the public discussion did not abide by official determinations. The discussion continued. The analysis continued. Because the questions are good questions. They are the right questions. They are the questions that any rigorous investigation of Ray Rivera's death must grapple with, and the fact that the official investigation did not grapple with them satisfactorily is not something that time or official determination can make go away. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a man who was 32 years old, who was loved, who was talented, who was building something real with his life. It leaves us with a night in April 2006 in Baltimore, when something went terribly wrong. It leaves us with a basement room and a hole in a wall, and a phone with an unfinished message and flip-flops and a locked door and 11 days of silence before the discovery. It leaves us with a ruling that many people, including the people who knew Ray best, do not believe. And it leaves us with Allison Rivera still asking, still pushing, still insisting that her husband deserved better than the answer that was given, still carrying the weight of everything that has not been resolved. The night of April 14, 2006 did not announce itself as anything special. It was a Friday. The work week was ending. Baltimore was settling into the particular looseness of a Friday evening, bars filling up, restaurants humming, people exhaling the tension of 5 days of obligation and letting themselves breathe a little easier. The spring air was soft. The city was alive in the way that cities are alive on Friday nights, with a warmth and a noise that feels almost celebratory. Ray Rivera was at home with Allison, and then he wasn't. The exact sequence of events on that Friday evening. The specific timeline of when Ray left, where he went, what happened between the moment he walked out the door and the moment his body came to rest in that basement room, is something that has never been fully reconstructed. Not publicly, not satisfactorily, not in a way that answers the questions that most need answering. But let's try. Let's take what is known and lay it out as carefully as we can. Because even in the gaps, even in the spaces between what we know and what we don't, there is information. There is the shape of something. And if you look at it long enough, that shape begins to tell you things. Ray left the apartment on the evening of April 14th. The exact time has been reported inconsistently across different sources, somewhere in the evening hours after dark or near dark. He was dressed casually, flip-flops, comfortable clothes, the outfit of someone running a quick errand, stepping out for a short time, expecting to return. He did not tell Allison in any memorable or alarming way where he was going. Or if he did, it was something ordinary enough that it did not register as significant. Something routine. He took his phone, he left. Now, between that moment and the moment he ended up at the Belvedere, there is a gap. A stretch of time that is essentially unaccounted for in the public record. We don't know with any confirmed specificity where Ray went first. We don't know who he might have contacted, who he might have met, what route he took through the city. What we know is the endpoint, the Belvedere Hotel, the parking garage adjacent to it, and the basement room where he was found. Getting from one to the other, from Ray Rivera leaving his apartment in flip-flops to Ray Rivera's body in a locked basement room, inside one of Baltimore's most historic buildings, requires a series of steps that have never been explained. Step 1. How did Ray get to the Belvedere? Did he drive, take a taxi, walk? The distance from his apartment to the Belvedere is not negligible. It is a meaningful stretch of city, not a casual stroll in flip-flops. And yet he was in flip-flops, which suggests again that whatever brought him to the Belvedere was not something he had planned on from the beginning of the evening. Step 2. How did Ray access the parking garage? The garage adjacent to the Belvedere is not a fully public space. It has access controls, entry points. Did Ray have a means of accessing it? Did someone let him in? Did he enter through a point that was unsecured? This has never been publicly clarified. Step 3. How did Ray get to the roof of the parking garage, if indeed that is where the fall originated? The roof of a parking structure is not an area most people have occasion to visit. It requires ascending through the levels of the structure, in flip-flops, in the dark, with some purpose or destination in mind. What was that purpose? What was Ray going there to do or to see or to meet? Step 4, what happened on that roof, or at whatever elevation the fall originated from, that resulted in Ray Rivera's body going through a wall and landing in a locked basement room, inside an adjacent building. These 4 steps are the skeleton of the mystery. They are the questions that an investigation fully committed to the truth would have answered, or died trying. And they are the questions that, to this day, have no confirmed public answers. Let me talk about something that very few people discussing this case have given adequate attention to: the locked room. The basement room where Ray was found was locked. This is not a minor detail. This is a significant detail that has enormous implications for how we understand the physical circumstances of his death. If Ray Rivera came through that hole in the wall, if his body entered that room via the breach in the wall from the parking garage side, then the question of the locked door is separate from the question of the hole. Ray didn't need to use the door to get into the room. He came through the wall. But here is the thing. The fact that the room was locked means that no one had opened it in the 11 days between Ray's death and his discovery. The room had been sealed. Whoever discovered Ray's body, the maintenance worker who eventually opened that door, was the first person to enter that room through the door after Ray died. Which means in those 11 days, no one had reason to go into that room. No one had gone looking. No one had opened the door and found what was on the other side. Now the Belvedere is a large building, a converted hotel with multiple floors, multiple common areas, multiple maintenance and utility spaces. It is entirely plausible that a basement room that is not regularly visited could go 11 days without being opened. This is not necessarily suspicious in itself, but it does raise a question about the building's security and awareness. In a residential building where people are coming and going, where maintenance staff are performing regular duties, how is it that a breach in a wall of a basement room went unnoticed for 11 days? How is it that no one, in the normal course of building operations, encountered that room or noticed that something was wrong? These are questions about the Belvedere's internal operations, about who was responsible for monitoring which spaces, about what the regular maintenance schedule looked like, about whether there were any reports of unusual sounds or observations in the days following April 14th that might have indicated something had happened. The answers to these questions, if they were pursued during the investigation, have not been made public in any comprehensive way. Let's go back to the geometry, because the geometry of this case is where the suicide ruling faces its most serious challenges, and I want to walk through it as carefully and as clearly as I can. The Belvedere Hotel and the adjacent parking garage share a relationship in space that is specific and measurable. The basement room where Ray was found is at a specific elevation relative to the various levels of the parking garage. The hole in the wall is at a specific height within that room. The angle at which the hole appears in the wall tells us something about the trajectory of whatever, or whoever, came through it. Independent analysts who have examined the physical evidence, working from photographs, from architectural details that are part of the public record, from the general layout of the Belvedere and its surrounding structures, have raised a consistent concern. For a human body to breach that wall at that location and at that angle, the trajectory required does not align cleanly with a fall from the roof of the parking garage. The angle is wrong. The physics don't work out neatly. This is not a minor technical objection. This is the core of the physical challenge to official ruling. If the trajectory doesn't align, if the angle of the body's entry through the wall is inconsistent with a fall from the most logical launch point, then the narrative of how Ray ended up in that room becomes significantly more complicated. Now, I am not a physicist. I am not a forensic analyst. And the precise technical details of the trajectory analysis are complex enough that responsible discussion of them requires acknowledging the limits of what can be determined from the publicly available evidence. But here is what I can say: the concerns that have been raised about the geometry are not frivolous. They are not the product of wishful thinking or conspiracy theorizing. They are the observations of people with relevant expertise who have looked at the physical facts and found them difficile with the official conclusion. And Alison Rivera, who has had access to information about this case that most of us have not, has consistently maintained that the physical evidence does not support the suicide ruling. She is not a person given to exaggeration or dramatic claims. She is a person who speaks carefully and who has thought about this more deeply than anyone else alive. When she says the physics don't work, that matters. Now I want to talk about something that adds a deeply strange dimension to an already strange case. The connection between the Belvedere Hotel and Ray Rivera's world. The connection that, on the night of April 14th, somehow brought him to that building and to that parking garage, may not have been as random as it initially appeared. Here is a detail that has emerged in various accounts of the case, including in reporting that followed the Unsolved Mysteries documentary. There were individuals connected to Stansberry Research who lived in or had connections to the Belvedere Hotel condominiums. This is not confirmed in a way that ties it definitively to Ray's death, but it changes the nature of the question about why Ray was at the Belvedere. The question shifts from why would Ray Rivera have any reason to go to the Belvedere Hotel, a building with which he had no connection, to was Ray going to see someone? Was he meeting someone there? Was he called there or drawn there by a person he knew through his work? If Ray went to the Belvedere to meet someone, if his presence there was not random but purposeful, the result of a call or a message or an arrangement, then everything about the night of April 14th looks different. It means someone knew he was coming. It means someone was expecting him. It means that whatever happened at the Belvedere that night may have been, at least in part, planned. This is the territory where the investigation needed to go, and whether it went there, whether investigators fully explored the question of who, if anyone, had asked Ray to come to that building on that night, is something that has not been established in the public record. Let me talk about the financial world more specifically, because understanding the specific texture of Stansberry Research's operations in 2006 is important context for understanding what Ray Rivera might have known and why that might have mattered. Stansberry Research was not a conventional financial institution. It was a publisher. It produced newsletters, long-form research documents that analyzed investments and made recommendations to subscribers who paid for the access. The model was enormously successful. At its peak, Stansberry Research had hundreds of thousands of subscribers paying significant annual fees for access to its various publications. The newsletters themselves existed in a regulatory gray zone that the SEC had been scrutinizing for years. Financial publishing of this kind, offering investment analysis and recommendations to the public, occupies a complicated legal space. Under certain interpretations of securities law, it is protected by the First Amendment as legitimate financial journalism. Under other interpretations, it constitutes investment advice that requires registration and carries legal obligations. The SEC case against Stansberry Research, the one that eventually resulted in a civil penalty against Porter Stansberry in 2007, centered on a specific allegation that one of the company's newsletters had published false information about a company's stock in exchange for undisclosed payment. This is what's known in the financial world as a pump and dump scheme, artificially inflating a stock's price through false positive coverage, then allowing those who initiated the scheme to profit. Porter Stansberry has always denied this characterization. He has always maintained that the newsletter in question reflected genuine analysis, and that the SEC case was an example of government overreach targeting legitimate financial speech. The legal dispute was bitter and prolonged, and it was ongoing in the period when Ray Rivera was working for the company. Now, what does a video producer know about a company's financial practices? Potentially quite a lot. Ray was not a peripheral figure at Stansberry Research. He was a trusted insider, someone with access to Porter Stansberry personally, someone who was producing content that was central to the company's public face. He was in meetings. He was in conversations. He was part of the inner circle of a company that was simultaneously fighting a major federal investigation. If Ray had become aware of something, some practice, some communication, some internal reality that complicated the picture that the company was presenting publicly. He was in a position where that knowledge would be significant, both to him and to others. I am not saying that this is what happened. I am saying that the possibility exists, that the structure of the situation created conditions in which it could have happened, and that an investigation genuinely committed to exploring every possibility would have pursued this threat aggressively. There is another element of this case that I want to address, because it comes up consistently in discussions of Ray Rivera's death, and because it touches on something genuinely important about how we understand what happened. The question of whether Ray Rivera was involved in something beyond his role as a video producer. In the months and years after his death, fragments of information emerged through interviews, through online research, through accounts from people connected to the Stansberry world, that suggested Ray may have taken on a role that went beyond content creation, that he may have been involved in some capacity in the company's broader operations, that his relationship with Porter Stansberry and with the company was more complex than the simple employer-employee or even close friend dynamic that was publicly described. What exactly this means, what form this expanded involvement might have taken, what it might have exposed Ray to, is not something that can be stated with confidence based on the public record. The specifics are murky and the sourcing is often difficult to verify, but the suggestion is consistent across enough different accounts that it is worth noting. And it adds another layer to the question of what Ray knew, and what that knowledge might have meant in the particular world he was inhabiting. Let me take you somewhere slightly different for a moment. Let's talk about the culture of Stansberry research, specifically, not the legal troubles, not the financial practices, but the culture, the atmosphere, what it was like to be inside that world. Financial newsletter publishing, particularly the variety that Stansberry research exemplified, is a world with a very specific texture. It attracts people who are contrarian by nature, people who believe they see things that mainstream financial institutions miss, who are skeptical of conventional wisdom, who are drawn to the thrill of finding the hidden truth beneath the surface of markets and economies and corporate behavior. It is a world of big personalities, of people who are deeply intelligent and deeply confident, who have made significant money, and who move through life with the particular self-assurance of people who believe they are smarter than most of the people around them. It is also, at its edges, a world where the line between bold analysis and manipulation can blur, where the pressure to produce compelling, subscription-driving content can push people toward claims that are stronger than the evidence supports, where the financial incentives create pressures that don't always align with the ethical imperatives of responsible financial journalism. Ray Rivera came from a film production background. He was creative, artistic, collaborative. He was not a financial person by nature or training, and when he entered the Stansberry research world, he entered a culture that was, in some ways, quite different from anything he had known. How did he navigate that difference? How did he reconcile his own values, his evident kindness, his integrity, his genuine quality of character, with the particular culture of the world he was now embedded in? We don't know. We can't know fully. But the question matters, because the friction between a person's character and the culture they inhabit is one of the places where trouble tends to develop. It is when a people start to see things they can't unsee, where they start to know things they wish they didn't know, where they start to make decisions about what to do with what they've learned. There is a specific thread in the investigation of Ray Rivera's death that has never been fully resolved, and that I want to address directly. The question of the days immediately preceding April 14th, not the weeks before, not the general period of his employment at Stansberry Research, but the specific days, the 72 hours, the 48 hours, the final 24 hours before Ray left his apartment for the last time. What was Ray doing in those final days? What we know from the available accounts is that he was working. He was at the Stansberry Research offices. He was engaged in whatever project or projects he was involved in at that point. He was, by external observation himself, present, professional, engaged. But there are specific details about those final days that have emerged in fragments, and that paint a slightly more complex picture. There is the suggestion that Ray made certain communications in that period, phone calls, messages that were not routine. That he reached out to specific people, or was reached out to by specific people, in ways that were outside his normal patterns. There is the suggestion that something happened in the Stansbury orbit in those final days. Some development, some conversation, some shift in the situation that Ray was adjacent to, that changed something, that moved something from a background concern to a foreground urgency. And there is the question of what Ray knew about the SEC investigation, about the specific legal and financial pressures that Stansbury Research was under in that period, and whether something he learned or discovered in those final days put him in a position that was, in some way, dangerous. These suggestions cannot be confirmed, but they cannot be dismissed either. And they form a coherent framework for understanding why a young man with everything to live for might have found himself, on a Friday night in April, drawn or driven to a parking garage rooftop adjacent to the Belvedere Hotel, not by his own choice, by someone else's. I want to talk about something that Alison Rivera has described in her public statements about this case. Something that, when you hear it, stops you. She has described the period after Ray's disappearance, the 11 days before his body was found, as a kind of suspended nightmare. A state of not knowing that is its own specific horror. She was searching. She was waiting. She was holding the possibility of hope alongside the growing certainty that something terrible had happened, and she was doing it alone. In a city that was not her own, surrounded by people whose relationship to the situation was complicated by their connections to Ray's professional world. She has described reaching out to Porter Stansbury and to others at the company. She has described the particular experience of being in a world where people knew Ray, where people had worked alongside him, where people expressed concern and offered help, and yet where something about the texture of that concern felt to her slightly off. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously deceptive, just not quite right in a way that she could feel but not articulate. That feeling, that sense of something being slightly off, of concern that didn't quite ring true, of help that was offered but felt somehow bounded, somewhat careful, is something she has mentioned multiple times in various forms. It may mean nothing. It may be the natural, understandable perception of a woman in crisis, reading too much into ordinary human behavior, because she was searching desperately for any signal that might tell her what had happened to her husband. Or it may mean exactly what it feels like it means, that someone in Ray's world knew something, that the concern being expressed was real but bounded by knowledge that couldn't be shared, that the help being offered was genuine but limited by the need to protect something or someone that was more importunation than full transparency. On April 25, 2006, the maintenance worker who opened that basement room in the Belvedere made his discovery. He opened the door. He found the hole in the wall. He found Ray Rivera. And whatever had been suspended in those 11 days, the searching, the hoping, the terrible in-between, collapsed into the specific, irreversible weight of knowing. Alison was notified. Ray's family was notified. The formal investigation, which had been running as a missing persons case, became something else, and Baltimore, which had been holding this secret in one of its oldest and grandest buildings, finally gave it up. Not the whole secret, just enough to confirm that Ray was gone. The forensic examination of Ray Rivera's body was conducted by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland. The findings in their broad outlines have been reported. Injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall from a significant height. The body had been in that room for 11 days in conditions that were not optimal for preservation. This affected the quality and completeness of the forensic examination. Certain determinations that might otherwise have been possible. Certain conclusions about the specific circumstances of injury. The precise sequence of events, the presence or absence of other parties, were rendered more difficult or impossible by the degradation of evidence over those 11 days. This is a tragedy within the tragedy. The 11 days that passed before Ray was found were not just 11 days of anguish for Allison and everyone who loved him. They were 11 days during which the physical record of what happened to Ray was slowly erased by time. 11 days during which whoever or whatever was responsible for Ray's death, if it was not what the official ruling says it was, had the opportunity to be further insulated from accountability by the passage of time and the degradation of evidence. The medical examiner's determination was blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. This is the foundation on which the suicide ruling was built. But the manner of death determination, the suicide, was a separate determination from the cause of death. Cause of death is medical. Manner of death is interpretive. It requires taking the medical findings and placing them in the context of the surrounding circumstances, the scene, the behavioral history, the presence or absence of other explanations. And it is in that interpretive step, in the move from cause to manner, where the most significant questions arise. Because the medical finding, fall from height, is consistent with suicide, it is also consistent with accident, and it is also consistent with homicide. A fall from height as a cause of death does not by itself determine manner. The manner determination requires the surrounding context, and the surrounding context of Ray Rivera's death, the locked room, the jagged hole in the wall, the flip-flops, the unfinished text message, the absence of a note, the contested geometry, the behavioral evidence from the people who knew him, when assembled honestly and completely, does not point clearly and ambiguously toward suicide. It points toward a question, a genuine, serious, unresolved question, and that question deserves a genuine, serious, unresolved answer. In the years between Ray's death and the Unsolved Mysteries episode in 2022, the case existed in a kind of limbo, known to those who had been close to it, to those who had followed true crime and cold case communities, to those who had a personal connection to the story, but not widely known. Not part of the broader public conversation about unsolved cases and official failures and the loved ones left behind by inadequate investigations. Allison continued to push. She connected with investigators, with legal professionals, with forensic experts. She sought out people with relevant expertise, and she shared what she knew and she listened to what they told her. And what they told her consistently was that the case deserved more scrutiny than it had received. That the official determination was not as solid as official determinations are supposed to be. That the questions she was asking were the right questions, and that they did not have satisfactory answers. This validation from people with expertise, with credibility, with no personal stake in the outcome, mattered to Allison not because it told her anything she didn't already know, but because it confirmed that her perception of the situation was not distorted by grief. That she was seeing clearly, that the ground she was standing on was real. Let me tell you about the world Ray Rivera inhabited in his final weeks from one more angle. From the angle of what it feels like to be inside a company that is under federal investigation. Because that experience, regardless of whether you are personally implicated, regardless of whether you have done anything wrong, has a specific texture that is worth understanding. When a company is under federal investigation, particularly an ongoing one with uncertain outcomes, the atmosphere inside that company changes. People become careful. Conversations that would ordinarily be open become guarded. Information that would ordinarily flow freely becomes sealed. People start thinking about what they know and what they've said, and what they might be asked about and how they would answer. Trust, the kind of easy, collaborative trust that makes a workplace function well, gets complicated. People look at each other differently. They wonder, they are careful. And in that environment, someone like Ray Rivera, someone with Porter Stansberry's personal trust, someone who was inside the inner circle, someone who was present for conversations and meetings and moments that more peripheral employees were not present for, would be in a particular position. He would know things. He would have heard things. He would have context that others didn't have. And in a company navigating a federal investigation, a person who knows things is both valuable and potentially complicated. Valuable because of the trust they represent. Complicated because of what they might say, or do, or decide to share with someone outside the circle. Whether any of this describes Ray Rivera's specific situation in April 2006 is not something I can state as fact. But it is a framework. It is a way of understanding how someone in Ray's position might have come to occupy a space that was, in ways he may not have fully understood, more fraught than it appeared. There is one more thing I want to cover in this chunk, and it is something that sits at the edge of what is known and what is speculated, but that I think deserves to be named clearly. The question of whether Ray Rivera was frightened, not visibly. Not in a way that his friends or colleagues could have pointed to definitively. But somewhere inside himself in those final days, in those final hours, was Ray Rivera afraid? The unfinished text message suggests urgency. It suggests that something was happening in the final moments of Ray's life that made him want to reach Allison immediately, not to say goodbye, not to deliver a considered final communication, but to reach out right then in real time. Because something was happening that required her to know something right now. That is not the behavior of a man who has made his peace. That is the behavior of a man in a rapidly developing situation that he did not choose and was not prepared for. And if Ray was in a situation he had not chosen, in a place he had not expected to end up, in a moment that was developing faster than he could manage, then what does that tell us about the nature of that moment? It tells us that something surprised him. That something brought him to the Belvedere, or to the parking garage, or to wherever the decisive moment was, under circumstances that were not entirely of his making. That he was responding to something external, something he encountered, something that overtook him. Whether that something was another person, whether there was a second presence in Ray Rivera's final moments, is the question that cannot be answered from the available evidence. But it cannot be ruled out either. And for Allison Rivera, it is the question that defines everything. There are things that investigations get right and things that investigations get wrong. And sometimes, in the cases that haunt us, in the cases that refuse to close quietly, the things that go wrong are not dramatic failures. They are not corrupt cover-ups or willful deceptions. They are quieter than that. They are the leads not followed with sufficient urgency. The questions asked once but not twice. The evidence examined but not deeply enough. The conclusions reached before all the available threads have been pulled. The Ray Rivera investigation, in the assessment of many people who've examined it carefully, was one of those quieter failures. Not a scandal, not a conspiracy. Just an investigation that settled too quickly on an explanation that the evidence did not fully support, and that did not pursue the alternatives with the rigor the situation demanded. Let's look at that investigation specifically. Let's look at what happened and what didn't happen when Ray Rivera's body was discovered on April 25, 2006. The Baltimore Police Department took over what had been a missing persons investigation and began treating it as a death investigation. Officers were dispatched to the Belvedere. The basement room was secured. The medical examiner's office was notified. The standard machinery of a death investigation began to turn. But from the beginning, that machinery was operating under a significant disadvantage: the 11-day gap. 11 days is an eternity in forensic terms. The window during which the most valuable physical evidence can be collected, trace evidence, biological material, the subtle physical indicators that tell investigators about the moments immediately surrounding a death. That window is measured in hours, sometimes in days, never in weeks. By the time investigators stood in that basement room of the Belvedere, much of what might have told them something definitive about the circumstances of Ray Rivera's death was simply gone. The body itself retained the information that bodies retain: the pattern of injuries, the condition of the remains, the broad strokes of what had happened physically. But the finer details, the granular evidence that separates one manner of death from another, the trace materials that might have indicated the presence of another person, those had degraded beyond recovery. The room itself had been sealed, which meant it had not been contaminated by subsequent human traffic. But sealed is not the same as preserved. 11 days is 11 days. Investigators were working, from the moment of discovery, with a diminished evidence base. And that diminished evidence base shaped every conclusion that followed. The security footage. Let me spend some time here because this is one of the most consequential and least discussed aspects of the investigation. The Belvedere Hotel, converted to condominiums, had a security system. Cameras at entry points. Cameras covering certain common areas. The kind of surveillance infrastructure that a residential building of that size and prestige would be expected to have. The adjacent parking garage also had cameras. Parking structures, by necessity, are monitored for the security of the vehicles stored in them and for the liability protection of the operators. Cameras at entry and exit points. Cameras covering the levels of the structure. Cameras that are recording continuously. In a case where a man was found dead inside a building he had no known connection to, where the central mystery is how he came to be there and what happened to him, the security footage from those cameras should have been the most important single piece of evidence available. It should have been the first thing investigators seized, the first thing they examined, the centerpiece of the forensic investigation. What did the cameras capture? Did they show Ray Rivera approaching the Belvedere? Did they show him entering the parking garage? Did they show him ascending through the levels of the structure? And critically, did they show anyone with him? Anyone preceding him or following him? Anyone who might have been present at the decisive moment? These are the questions that the security footage could have answered. Definitively, clearly. In a way that would have either supported or undermined the suicide determination with something more concrete than inference. What the investigation found in that footage, what those cameras actually captured on the night of April 14th and in the days that followed, has never been fully disclosed publicly. The Baltimore Police Department has not, to the knowledge of most people who have followed this case closely, provided a detailed accounting of what the security footage showed. This absence is one of the most frustrating elements of the public record of this investigation. Because the possibilities are limited and none of them are comfortable. Either the footage showed Ray Rivera alone, approaching alone, ascending alone, with no other person visible in the relevant areas at the relevant times, in which case it would have been powerful evidence supporting the suicide determination, and it is unclear why investigators would not have used it to shut down the persistent questions about the case. Or the footage showed something else. Something that complicated the picture. Something that raised questions rather than answering them. Something that made the simple narrative of a solitary suicide harder to maintain. Or the footage showed nothing useful, because the cameras didn't cover the relevant areas, because the coverage had gaps, because the angles were wrong or the resolution was insufficient. In which case a significant potential source of evidence simply wasn't there. Any of these three scenarios has implications. The first implies a failure of transparency. The second implies a failure of follow-through. The third implies a failure of the investigation to adequately account for its own limitations. None of them is reassuring. All of them leave the central question unanswered. Let's talk about the witness interviews. In the days following Ray Rivera's discovery, investigators spoke with the people in his life. Allison Porter Stansberry, colleagues at Stansberry Research, people who had known Ray personally, who had seen him recently, who might have information about his state of mind or his activities in the period before his death. From the accounts that have made it into the public record, through Allison's statements, through reporting around the Unsolved Mysteries episode, through various journalistic accounts of the case, a picture of those interviews begins to emerge. Allison herself was interviewed extensively. She told investigators everything she knew about Ray's state of mind, about his work, about the evening of April 14th, about the days leading up to it. She was consistent and clear and, by her own account, fully cooperative. She wanted investigators to have every piece of information she could give them. She also told them, from the earliest days of the investigation, that she did not believe Ray had killed himself. She told them why. She laid out the specific evidence-based reasons for her conviction, the flip-flops, the unfinished message, the absence of any behavioral indicators of suicidal intent, the contested geometry of the scene. She made her case clearly and she made it early. The investigators listened. Whether they gave her concerns the weight they deserved is a different question. Porter Stansberry was also interviewed. He was, by available accounts, cooperative. He provided information about his relationship with Ray, about Ray's role at the company, about the events of the days preceding April 14th. He expressed grief. He answered the questions that were put to him. But here's a question worth asking: how deep did those interviews go? How probing were the questions about the specific nature of Ray's work in his final weeks? How thoroughly were investigators examining the professional context, the SEC investigation, the financial operations, the specific projects Ray had been involved in, as a potential avenue of investigation? The public record does not give us a detailed accounting of the depth of those interviews. What we know is that the investigation ultimately ruled Ray's death a suicide, which implies that whatever investigators learned in those interviews did not point them toward a different conclusion strongly enough to change their direction. But absence of a finding is not the same as a finding of absence. And the depth and rigor of those interviews, how far they actually went into the complicated terrain of Ray's professional world, remains an open question. There are specific individuals in the Stansberry research orbit whose connection to Ray Rivera's story has been discussed in various public forums and investigative accounts. I want to address some of these carefully, because this is territory where responsible discussion requires precision. The world of Stansberry research in 2006 was populated by people who were, in many cases, genuinely brilliant and genuinely eccentric. Financial publishing of that kind attracts a specific personality type: contrarian, confident, intellectually aggressive, often deeply unconventional in their thinking and their behavior. Some of these individuals had connections to Ray that went beyond the merely professional. Some of them were people Ray had spent significant time with, had worked alongside closely, had perhaps shared conversations and confidences with in the way that people do when they are part of an inner circle. Whether any of these individuals knew something about what happened to Ray, whether any of them had information that was not shared with investigators, or that was shared in incomplete or misleading ways, is not something that can be established from the public record. What can be said is that the network of people surrounding Ray in his final weeks was not a simple one. It was a network of complicated loyalties and significant financial interests, and the particular kind of mutual protection that develops among people who share sensitive knowledge about a business under federal scrutiny. In that kind of network, information is managed carefully. What gets said to investigators, and what doesn't, is a calculation that people in that situation make consciously and strategically. Whether that management of information affected the Ray Rivera investigation, whether there were things that people knew they did not share, things that might have pointed the investigation in a different direction, is an open question. It is a question that Alison Rivera has clearly found worth asking. Let me talk about the partial text message in more detail, because I think it has not been given adequate attention in most discussions of this case. Ray Rivera's phone was found near his body in that basement room. The phone was examined by investigators, and on the phone was a message: started, composed, and never completed, never sent. The message was addressed to Alison now. Think about the circumstances under which someone starts typing a text message to their spouse in the final minutes of their life. If you are in a peaceful state, if you have made a decision, if you are at the end of a deliberate process, you do not reach for your phone and begin typing a message that you never finish. You have either already said your goodbyes, or you have chosen not to. You are not in the middle of a communication that you abandon. But if you are in a situation that is developing rapidly around you, if something is happening that you did not anticipate, that you cannot fully control, that is moving faster than your ability to respond, then reaching for your phone and trying to get a message out makes a different kind of sense. It is the behavior of someone who is trying to communicate urgency, who knows that something is happening that the person they love needs to know about, who is trying to get that information out before it's too late, and who runs out of time. The unfinished nature of the message is itself significant. Not a complete message that says what it needs to say. Not even a message that gets through most of what it was trying to say. A partial message, a start, A few words or a few lines that gesture towards something important, but don't complete the communication. That partial message, that reaching out that didn't make it, is one of the most haunting details in the entire Ray Rivera case, because it tells us that in his final moments Ray Rivera's mind was on Allison. He was trying to reach her. He was trying to tell her something. He didn't make it. What he was trying to tell her has never been made public. The full text of that partial message, the specific words that Ray Rivera typed in the last minutes of his life, remains known only to investigators and perhaps to Allison herself. And that silence, that withholding of the specific content of Ray's last communication, is something that has never been satisfactorily explained. Now I want to address head-on the specific arguments that have been made for the suicide ruling and why those arguments fail to satisfy. The argument for suicide rests on several pillars. First, the nature of the injuries. The medical examiner found injuries consistent with a fall from height. This is true. Falls from height produce the kind of blunt force trauma that was documented in Ray Rivera's case. But, and this is the critical point, falls from height also produce the same injuries regardless of whether the fall was voluntary, accidental, or the result of being thrown or pushed. The injuries alone cannot distinguish between these possibilities. They establish the mechanism but not the manner. They tell us how Ray died but not why. Second, the absence of evidence pointing to another party. Investigators found no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no forensic trace, directly connecting another person to the scene. But this argument requires ignoring the 11-day gap. It requires treating the degraded, time-affected evidence base of a crime scene examined 11 days after the fact as though it were the equivalent of a scene examined hours after the event. It is not. The absence of forensic evidence connecting another party to the scene means far less when that evidence has had 11 days to degrade than it would in a properly preserved, promptly examined scene. Third, the suggestion, based on witness interviews and the note or document found in Ray's possession, that Ray's state of mind was consistent with someone in distress. This argument is the weakest of the three, because it runs directly contrary to the accounts of virtually everyone who knew Ray in his final weeks. The people closest to him, Allison, his friends, his colleagues, have consistently described a man who was preoccupied but not despairing, busy but not broken. Not a man at the edge. The document found in Ray's possession, the one with the list of names, has been interpreted in ways that are, at best, highly ambiguous. A list of names is not a suicide note. It is not evidence of suicidal ideation. And the attempt to read it as such reflects an investigative posture that was looking for evidence to support a predetermined conclusion, rather than follow an evidence wherever it led. None of these three pillars supports the suicide ruling with the kind of certainty that an official determination of manner of death should require. Each of them has significant problems. Each of them leaves room for alternative explanations. And the alternative explanations, accident or homicide, are not merely theoretical. They are supported by the same evidence base, and in some respects more strongly supported. Let me talk about the specific alternative theory that has the most support among the people who have examined this case carefully. Not an elaborate conspiracy theory, not a wild speculation, a straightforward, evidence-consistent alternative account of what may have happened to Ray Rivera on the night of April 14, 2006. The framework goes like this. Ray received a communication, a call, a message on the evening of April 14th that prompted to go somewhere. The communication was from someone he knew, someone connected to his world, someone he trusted enough to respond to without alarm and without preparation. He left in flops. He did not tell Allison anything alarming because nothing, at that point, alarmed him. He was going to someone. A short meeting. He'd be back. He went to the Belvedere, or to the parking garage adjacent to it. He went because someone asked him to. Someone who had a connection to that building, who lived there, or had access to it, or had arranged for a meeting there for reasons that Ray did not fully understand. Something happened at that meeting. Something that moved from a conversation into something else. Something that Ray could not have anticipated and could not control. Something that developed fast enough that his only recourse was to reach for his phone. and try to get a message to Allison. A message he never completed. And then he was on the roof of that parking garage. By what means, whether he went there willingly under some pretext, or whether he was moved there against his will, but he was there. And whatever happened on that roof in those final moments resulted in his body going over the edge and through the wall of the Belvedere and into that locked basement room. This framework accounts for the physical evidence in ways that the suicide ruling does not. It accounts for the flip-flops, because Ray left without preparation. In response to a call he did not anticipate, it accounts for the absence of a note, because Ray did not know he was going to die. He was going to a meeting. It accounts for the unfinished text message, because something happened fast, in a situation Ray found himself in suddenly, and he was trying to communicate that urgency to Allison before it was too late. It accounts for the behavioral evidence from everyone who knew him, because Ray Rivera was not suicidal. He was a man who was loving his life, who was excited about his future, who was deeply connected to his wife and his work and his sense of what was ahead. And it accounts in a general way for the geometry, because a person who is moved over the edge of a roof, or who goes over it in the course of a violent confrontation, does not necessarily describe the same trajectory as a person who jumps deliberately. The angle, the force, the specifics of how a body leaves a surface under those different circumstances can produce different physical outcomes. This framework does not solve the mystery. It does not name a perpetrator. It does not establish with certainty that this is what happened, but it is consistent with the evidence. And it is more consistent with the evidence, in several important respects, than the official ruling. If this framework is correct, or something like it, is one that cannot be answered fully without knowing what Ray knew, what he had discovered, or was close to discovering, or had already come to understand about the world he was inhabiting. The SEC investigation into Stansberry research provides one potential context for a motive. If Ray had information that was relevant to that investigation, if he had witnessed something, learned something, been privy to significant to federal investigators, then his position in the world of Stansberry research would have been complicated in ways that he might not have fully appreciated. People who are in possession of sensitive information, in environments where that information could be damaging to powerful interests, sometimes find themselves in danger. Not always, not inevitably, but sometimes, in the history of such situations, in financial fraud cases, in corporate corruption investigations, in any environment where the exposure of wrongdoing could carry serious consequences for serious people, includes cases where people who knew too much ended up unable to tell anyone. I am not saying this is what happened to Ray Rivera. I am saying that it is a framework that deserves to be taken seriously, that is consistent with the available evidence, and that the official investigation does not appear to have pursued with the rigor it deserved. There is something that Allison Rivera said in the Unsolved Mysteries documentary that has stayed with me, and I want to share it here because it captures something essential about this case. She said, in substance, that what she needed was not a particular answer. She was not coming to the investigation with a predetermined conclusion that she needed validated. What she needed was a real investigation. One that genuinely pursued all the possibilities. One that asked all the hard questions and followed them wherever they led. One that treated her husband's death with the seriousness it deserved. She did not get that investigation. What she got was a ruling. A determination made from a degraded evidence base in an investigation that settled on a conclusion without exhausting the alternatives. A determination that has been challenged from the beginning by the people who knew Ray best and by independent experts who have examined the evidence. And that ruling, that inadequate, insufficiently supported ruling, is what she has been living with for nearly 20 years. The weight of that is some difficult to fully convey. Not just the grief of losing Ray, which would be enormous on its own, but the specific, grinding, ongoing burden of knowing that the story of how your husband died has been told wrong, that the official record contains a falsehood, that the people who were supposed to find the truth settled for something easier, That is a specific kind of suffering that does not diminish with time. It accumulates. After the Unsolved Mysteries documentary aired in 2022, there was a period of intense public interest in the Ray Rivera case. The episode was watched by millions of people. Social media discussions exploded. True crime communities devoted enormous energy to analyzing the available evidence and developing frameworks for understanding what might have happened. Some of that analysis was valuable. Some of it identified details and connections that had not been widely discussed. Some of it brought new eyes and new perspectives to evidence that had been examined before, but perhaps not from every angle. Some of it was less valuable, spiraling into speculation, attributing guilt to individuals without evidence, pursuing threads that led nowhere, or worse, to the harassment of people who had no demonstrable connection to Ray's death. The Baltimore Police Department, in the wake of the documentary, received renewed public attention and renewed questions about the case. They maintained their position. The ruling stood. The case remained officially closed. But officially closed is not the same as resolved, and the distance between those two things is where Alison Rivera lives, where she has always lived, where she will continue to live until the truth of what happened to her husband is established with the kind of certainty that official investigations are supposed to provide, but in this case did not. There were also, in the wake of the documentary, people who came forward with information. People who had connections to the Stansberry research world, or to Baltimore in that period, or to individuals who had been part of Ray's life. People who had things to say that they had not previously said publicly. Some of these accounts have been explored by journalists and researchers. Some of them have added texture to the picture, additional context about the culture of Stansberry research, about specific individuals who were part of Ray's world, about the particular atmosphere of that environment in the period before and after Ray's death. None of them, as far as can be established from the public record, have produced the specific, concrete, independently verifiable evidence that would definitively establish what happened to Ray Rivera on April 14, 2006. But they have continued to sustain the sense, felt by many people across many different backgrounds and perspectives, that the official account of Ray Rivera's death is wrong, that there is something else, that the truth is still out there, somewhere in the world, known to someone who has not yet chosen to share it fully. Let me tell you something about the nature of secrets. Secrets in the short term are easy, especially when the people who need to keep them are motivated by self-interest and protected by the degradation of evidence and the passage of time. In the immediate aftermath of something, in the weeks and months when an investigation is active and attention is focused, secrets can be maintained by people who are careful and who have the motivation to be careful. But in the long term, secrets are harder. Time does something to them. The circumstances that made them necessary change. The people who held an age move on, reconsider. Loyalties shift. The calculus of risk and benefit that originally made silence seem like the right choice gets recalculated. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, secrets that have been held for years eventually find their way out. The Ray Rivera case is nearly 20 years old. The people who were part of his world in 2006 have lived those 20 years. Their lives have changed. Their circumstances have changed. The company that Ray worked for has continued to evolve and face its own complicated history. Porter Stansberry himself has moved on from the company he founded. Whether any of that change has produced, or will produce, new information about what happened to Ray, whether anyone who knows something has decided, or will decide, that the time has come to share it, is something that cannot be predicted. But it is possible. It is the kind of possibility that cases like this one rest on. The possibility that truth, however long it takes, eventually finds a way through. Alison Rivera has not given up. That is perhaps the single most important thing to carry forward from everything we have covered. Because in cases like this one, cases where the official investigation has reached a conclusion that does not satisfy, where the evidence has been examined and found inadequate, where the loved ones of the deceased are left holding a ruling they do not believe, the difference between a case that stays alive and a case that quietly dies is often one person's refusal to stop, Alison Rivera has refused to stop. She has done it with grace and with clarity and with a specific, focused determination that is, in its own way, a testament to who Ray Rivera was and to the quality of the love between them. She is not conducting a crusade driven by denial. She is conducting an investigation driven by evidence, by the specific, physical, forensic, behavioral evidence that the official investigation did not adequately weigh. She wants the truth. Not the truth she wishes were true, but the actual truth, the documented, demonstrated, irrefutable truth of what happened to her husband on a spring night in Baltimore nearly 20 years ago. She deserves it. Ray Rivera deserves it. And somewhere in the world, the truth exists. In someone's memory, in an unexamined piece of evidence, in a conversation that has not yet been had or a decision that has not yet been made to speak. The truth of Ray Rivera's death is out there. It has not been told yet, but the search for it continues. There are cases that change the people who follow them, not just the loved ones. Though God knows the loved ones are changed most profoundly, changed in ways that reach into every corner of their lives and never fully leave. But the people who come to a case from outside, the journalists, the researchers, the ordinary people who stumble across a story late at night and find themselves unable to put it down. The people who read the details and feel something shift inside them, some certainty about how the world works, some assumption about the reliability of official institutions, some comfortable belief that when something terrible happens, the systems we have built to respond to it will do their job properly. The Ray Rivera case changes people like that, because it is not a case about dramatic institutional corruption. It is not a case about obvious villains and clear-cut failures. It is a case about something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling, about an investigation that moved too quickly, settled too easily, and produced a ruling that has never been satisfactorily supported by the physical evidence it was supposed to rest on. It is a case about what happens when the machinery of justice works at less than its full capacity, when the questions that most needed asking were not asked with sufficient persistence, when the evidence that most needed examining had degraded beyond full recovery before anyone understood what they were looking at. It is a case about Ray Rivera, who was 32 years old and full of life and love and plans, and about what it means that the story of his death has been told wrong. And it is a case about Alison, about what it costs a person to carry the weight of an unresolved truth for nearly 2 decades, about what it means to love someone and lose them and then be told, by the official institutions that are supposed to speak with authority on such matters, that the story of their death is settled, when you know, with every fiber of your being, that it is not. Let's go deeper into what the years since Ray's death have produced, into what has been learned, what has been attempted, what has emerged from the ongoing effort to understand what happened on the night of April 14, 2006, in the immediate aftermath of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, which aired in 2022 and brought the case to millions of new viewers. Something interesting happened in the public discussion of Ray Rivera's death. It wasn't just that people became interested. Interest is common. Any well-told true crime story generates interest, and Unsolved Mysteries has always had a particular talent for presenting cases in ways that engage people deeply. What was different about the Ray Rivera episode was the quality of the engagement it produced. The people who watched it and then went looking for more information, who went to the forums and the discussion threads and the research communities that had been examining this case for years, found themselves in a situation that is relatively rare in true crime, a case where the more you learned, the more the official explanation failed. Most cold cases, when you go looking, turn out to be genuinely ambiguous. The evidence is thin. The possibilities are multiple. The official determination, even if not airtight, is at least defensible. You can understand how investigators reached the conclusion they reached. Even if you have questions, the Ray Rivera case is different. The more you learn about it, the worse the official ruling looks. Not because new evidence emerges that dramatically contradicts it, though the geometric and forensic arguments are significant, but because the accumulation of detail, the layering of context upon context, builds a picture that simply does not look like suicide. The flip-flops get more significant the more you think about them, not less. The unfinished text message gets more haunting the more you consider it, not less. The absence of any behavioral indicator of suicidal intent becomes more glaring the more accounts of Ray's final weeks you read. The geometry becomes more problematic the more carefully you examine the layout of the Belvedere and the adjacent parking structure. Everything, looked at carefully, points away from the official conclusion, and nothing examined honestly points clearly toward it. This is why the case continues to resonate. This is why, years after it first attracted public attention, it still generates discussion and analysis, and the particular kind of passionate engagement that marks a case where people believe, genuinely believe, that the truth has not been told. Let me talk about something that has not received enough attention in most discussions of this case. The timeline of Ray Rivera's disappearance and the response to it in the first 24 to 48 hours. When Allison realized that Ray had not come home. When the hours had accumulated past the point where ordinary lateness could account for his absence, she began making calls. She reached out to Porter Stansberry. She reached out to people in Ray's world. She was trying to find him, trying to understand where he was, trying to generate the kind of response from the people around her that the situation warranted. What she received in those early hours was, by her account, a response that was characterized by concern but also by a certain quality of carefulness. People were helpful but in a bounded way. People expressed alarm, but in a modulated way. The energy of the response did not quite match the urgency of the situation. Now, this perception could be explained in many ways. When someone goes missing, the people around them don't always immediately grasp the severity of what might have happened. Adults disappear for all kinds of reasons. The assumption, in the first hours of an absence, is often that there is a mundane explanation, a dead phone, an unexpected delay, a miscommunication. The alarm ramps up gradually as the ordinary explanations are eliminated. But Allison's perception, shaped by her knowledge of Ray, by her certainty that something was wrong, by the particular quality of her attention to the situation, was that the response around her was not quite what it should have been. Not quite urgent enough. Not quite open enough. Not quite the response of people who were as surprised and alarmed as the situation warranted. Whether that perception reflects something real, whether there were people in Ray's world who knew, or suspected, or had reason to believe something about what had happened to him that influenced the quality of their response, is not something that can be established from the available record. But it is something that Allison noticed, and Allison's observations in this case have proven consistently worth taking seriously. There is a specific aspect of the investigation that has attracted sustained attention from the people who have examined this case most carefully, and I want to address it directly. The question of who had knowledge of the Belvedere's basement room. The room where Ray was found was not a prominently known space within the building. It was a utility or storage space, the kind of room that most residents of a large converted building would have no particular reason to know about. Not a room you'd find by wandering. Not a room you'd stumble in accidentally. For Ray Rivera to have ended up in that room, whether through a fall from the parking garage or through any other means, someone would need to have had some knowledge of the building's layout, some awareness of where that room was in relation to the parking garage, some understanding of the specific geography that connected the garage to that basement space. This knowledge would not be universal. It would belong to people who had a specific kind of familiarity with the Belvedere, residents, maintenance workers, people who had spent significant time in the building and had reason to know its less visited spaces. If Ray was called to the Belvedere by someone, if his presence there was the result of an arranged meeting rather than a random decision, then the person who called it there had knowledge of that building. They knew it. They had a reason to designate it as the meeting place, and if that meeting place was chosen with the specific geography of the building in mind, with knowledge of the relationship between the parking garage and the basement room, with awareness of where a person falling from the garage would most likely end up, then the choice of location was not random either. This line of reasoning cannot be confirmed. It requires making inferences that go beyond what the available evidence directly supports. But it is a line of reasoning that is internally consistent, and that points toward a level of planning and local knowledge that would significantly narrow the field of people who could have been responsible for what happened to Ray. Let me talk about Porter Stansberry again. Not to implicate him, he has never been charged with any crime related to Ray's death, but to think carefully about what his perspective on this case has been and what it tells us. Porter Stansberry has spoken publicly about Ray Rivera on various occasions. He has expressed grief and loss. He has described Ray as a close friend and valued colleague. He has, by all available accounts, maintained a consistent position that Ray's death was a tragedy, that the official ruling was what it was, and that he has shared with investigators everything he knew. What is interesting is not what Porter Stansberry has said publicly about Ray Rivers' death, but what he has not said. He has not been a vocal advocate for reopening the investigation. He has not, in the way that Alison Rivera has, pushed publicly for a more thorough examination of the circumstances of Ray's death. He has not joined his voice to hers in calling the official ruling into question. This could mean many things. It could mean that Porter Stansberry accepts the official ruling and has processed Ray's death as a suicide, however painful that is. It could mean that his public silence on the matter is a response to legal advice or professional calculation rather than a reflection of his private beliefs. It could mean many things. What it has produced in the minds of people who have followed this case is a question. A quiet, persistent question about what Porter Stansberry knows or believes he knows about what happened to Ray Rivera. Whether that question has an answer beyond the obvious. Beyond the answer that he is a private person who processes things privately and who is not obligated to conduct his grief in public, is something that cannot be determined from the outside. But the question is there. It has always been there. And it remains unanswered. There is a dimension of the Ray Rivera case that intersects with something much larger, with the broader culture of financial publishing, of investment newsletters, of the specific ecosystem of contrarian financial advice that Stansberry research was part of. That world, in the mid-2000s, was in a particular moment. The SC was paying increased attention to financial newsletter publishers. The line between legitimate financial journalism and unregistered investment advice was being actively litigated. Companies that operated in that space were navigating a regulatory environment that was becoming more scrutinizing, more adversarial, more consequential. Stansberry Research was not the only company in this space facing regulatory attention. It was part of a broader ecosystem of financial publishers who were all, to varying degrees, operating in territory that regulators were beginning to examine more closely. In this environment, information was extremely sensitive. What a company knew was doing, what its practices were. These were matters of enormous significance, both for the company's legal exposure and for its business survival. The people inside these companies who had access to sensitive information, who knew what was really happening, who had visibility into the gap between what was publicly represented and what was actually going on, were in a position that carried real risk. Not necessarily the risk of violence. In most cases, in most companies, the risk was professional, the risk of being pressured to stay quiet, of being managed out, of finding oneself on the wrong side of a loyalty calculation, the risk of knowing something that powerful people would prefer you didn't know, and of having to navigate what to do with that knowledge. But in cases where the stakes were sufficiently high, where the information in question could have had severe legal and financial consequences for the people it implicated, the risk could be more than professional. Whether the information Ray Rivera may have possessed crossed that threshold, whether what he knew was serious enough to make him a genuine threat to someone, is not something that can be confirmed. But the structure of the situation, the specific world Ray was inhabiting, was one in which the threshold existed, in which it was possible for someone to know too much. Let me tell you about the online community that has grown around this case. Not the sensational, accusation-slinging portions of it, but the careful, rigorous, genuinely investigative portions. In the years since the Unsolved Mysteries episode, there have been communities of people who have dedicated significant time and energy to examining the Ray Rivera case with the kind of methodical attention that the official investigation perhaps should have applied. They have obtained and analyzed architectural documents relating to the Belvedere. They have examined the physics of falls and trajectories. They have researched the backgrounds and connections of people in Ray's world. They have mapped the geography of Mount Vernon, traced the layout of the parking garage, tried to reconstruct the specific geometry of how a body could have traveled from the garage to that basement room. Some of this work has been genuinely valuable. It has produced analyses that are more rigorous and more detailed than anything in the publicly available official record. It has identified specific technical problems with the suicide ruling that are not widely discussed but that are, once you understand them, very hard to dismiss. Some of it has been less valuable, productive of heat rather than light, generating more theory than evidence, occasionally crossing lines into unfair treatment of individuals who may have no connection to Ray's death. But the best of it represents something important: the application of genuine intellectual rigor to a question that the official investigation left unresolved. The refusal to accept inadequate answers. The commitment to following evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable, even when it leads toward questions that powerful institutions would prefer not to answer. This kind of community engagement cannot replace a proper investigation. It cannot subpoena witnesses. It cannot compel the production of evidence. It cannot conduct forensic examinations or compel testimony. What it can do, what it has done, is keep the case alive, keep the questions visible, keep the pressure, however diffuse, on the institutions that have the power to actually answer them. And in a case like this one, where the official investigation fell short, that pressure matters. It is not nothing. It is part of what keeps the possibility of eventual truth alive. There is something I want to address that comes up frequently in discussions of the Ray Rivera case, and that I think deserves a clear, honest response. The suggestion that Alison Rivera's refusal to accept the suicide ruling is a product of grief rather than evidence. That she is a wife who cannot accept the loss of her husband, in the particular way the official record says it happened, and that her persistent advocacy is driven by love and pain rather than by a clear-eyed assessment of the facts. I want to say clearly this characterization does not hold up. Alison Rivera's objections to the official ruling are not emotional. They are evidentiary. She has not said, in substance, Ray would never do this because he loved life and he loved me. She has said, the physical evidence does not support this determination. The geometry is inconsistent with the ruling. The behavioral evidence contradicts the suicide framework. The scene has specific characteristics that are not explained by the official account. These are not the objections of a grieving wife who cannot accept reality. These are the objections of a person who has examined the evidence and found the official conclusion inadequate. And these objections have been validated, consistently, repeatedly, by people with relevant expertise who have no personal stake in the outcome. Forensic analysts, investigative journalists, physicists, former law enforcement professionals who have examined this case have, again and again, found the same problems that Alison found. The dismissal of her concerns as grief, driven rather than evidence, driven is itself a kind of failure. It is the application of a condescending framework that assumes a bereaved person cannot be simultaneously grieving and thinking clearly. It is the use of her loss as a reason to discount her intelligence and her analysis. Alison Rivera has never confused her grief with her evidence. She carries both, and the evidence she carries is sound. Let me think carefully, for a moment, about what justice would look like in this case. Not what is likely. Not what is probable given the current state of the evidence and the official record. But what justice, real, complete, satisfying justice, would actually look like for Ray Rivera and for Alison. It would look like a reinvestigation, a genuine one, conducted by people with the authority and the resources to compel testimony, to access evidence that has not been publicly available, to examine the security footage fully, to pursue the financial and professional context of Ray's final weeks with the depth it deserves. It would look like the full disclosure of the contents of Ray's partial text message, Whatever he was trying to say to Allison in the last minutes of his life, she deserves to know those words fully, without redaction or paraphrase. It would look like a proper accounting of the forensic evidence, of the specific trajectory analysis, of the geometric relationship between the parking garage and the basement room, of whether the physical facts of the scene are actually consistent with the official ruling when examined by independent experts with full access to all the available data. It would look like honest answers from the people in Ray's professional world, from whoever knew what Ray was working on in those final weeks, from whoever can account for the specific nature of the project or the knowledge that may have made him vulnerable. And ultimately, it would look like the truth, whatever that truth is. Even if it is complicated, even if it is uncomfortable, even if it implicates people or institutions that would prefer it to remain hidden. That is what justice looks like in this case. Whether it is achievable, whether the passage of nearly 20 years and the degradation of evidence and the resistance of official institutions to revisiting their own conclusions can be overcome, is a question that cannot be answered with confidence. But the possibility exists. Truth, in cases like this one, does not have a statute of limitations. It does not expire. It exists somewhere, in someone's knowledge or in some piece of evidence that has not yet been examined with the right eyes. And the search for it continues. Ray Rivera was 32 years old when he died. He had been married to Allison, the love of his life, for years. He had a career he was proud of and skills he had spent years developing in a future full of possibility. He had friends who loved him. He had family who needed him. He had plans, the specific, vivid, forward-looking plans of a person who was fully engaged in being alive. He did not, by any account from anyone who knew him, want to die. He was taken from the world on a spring night in Baltimore, under circumstances that have never been adequately explained, by something that has never been adequately identified. And the woman he loved has spent nearly 20 years holding that truth and demanding that the world acknowledge it. There is something about this case, about the combination of Ray's vivid humanity and Allison's unwavering determination and the specific, maddening incompleteness of the official account, that makes it impossible to simply move on from. That makes it stick. That makes it the kind of case you find yourself thinking about at odd moments, turning over in your mind, returning to with the hope that some new angle of consideration will suddenly make everything clear. It doesn't become clear. That is the nature of it. The clarity that the official ruling offers is a false clarity, a premature closure that papers over genuine uncertainty with the language of determination. The genuine clarity, if it ever comes, will come from somewhere else, from someone who decides to speak, from evidence that surfaces after years of obscurity, from an investigation that brings the full weight of institutional authority to the questions that have been waiting, patiently and persistently, for nearly 2 decades. I want to spend some time on what we know about Ray Rivera as a person, not in the general, biographical terms we covered earlier, but in the specific texture of who he was in the period of his life just before he died. People who knew Ray in Baltimore, who worked alongside him at Stansberry Research, who encountered him in the social world that surrounded the company, describe a man who was adjusting well to his new city, who had found his footing, who was engaged and present and characteristically warm in his interactions with the people around him. He was, by those accounts, happy, or at least in the process of building something that was moving toward happiness, the particular kind of contentment that the pieces of your life are falling into place, that the bet you made on a new city and a new opportunity was paying off. He and Allison were finding their rhythm in Baltimore. The city was becoming home in the way that new cities become home, slowly, through the accumulation of small familiar experiences, through the gradual development of the knowledge of where to go and what to expect and who the people are. Ray was excited about his work. He was engaged with the projects he was involved in. He was, by all evidence, a person who was invested in the future, in what the coming months and years would bring, in what he and Allison would build together. This is not the profile of a man in the grip of suicidal despair. This is the profile of a man who was in the middle of building something, Who had reasons to stay? Who was looking forward, not toward the end? There is one more specific detail I want to address before we move into our final sections of this story. A detail that has not been widely discussed but that, once you know it, is very difficult to explain away. The condition of the hole in the wall. The hole through which Ray Rivera's body apparently came. The breach in the wall of the Belvedere's basement room that faced toward the parking garage was not a clean aperture. It was jagged. It was irregular. It had the characteristics of an opening that was made by something coming through it with force. But here is the detail that matters: the displacement of the wall material. When something breaches a wall, when an object or a body comes through it with enough force to create an opening, the wall material is displaced in a specific direction. The direction of displacement tells you the direction of travel. Material displaced inward, into the room, indicates something coming from outside. Material displaced outward, away from the room, indicates something coming from inside. The displacement pattern of the hole in the Belvedere basement room wall has been described, in the accounts available, as consistent with something coming from the parking garage side, with the direction of impact being from outside the building inward. This is what the suicide framework requires. If Ray fell from the parking garage and came through the wall into the basement room, the material should be displaced inward into the room, and by available accounts it is. But here is what makes this interesting. The force required to breach a wall of that kind, a wall in a century-old building, with the construction characteristics of a building from that era, is not trivial. A human body falling from the roof of the adjacent parking garage would need to be traveling at a specific velocity, at a specific angle, to generate enough force to create that kind of breach, and the trajectory required to generate that force, at that angle from the roof of the parking garage is, according to the analysts who have examined it most carefully, not simply the trajectory of a person jumping off a ledge. It is a trajectory that requires specific conditions. That requires a specific angle of departure from the surface of the garage. That does not align cleanly with the physics of a voluntary jump, or an accidental fall from the most accessible point on that structure. What it might align with, and this is where the most uncomfortable speculation lies, is the physics of a body that left the surface of that garage not under its own power, but under someone else's. The city of Baltimore has never publicly reckoned with the Ray Rivera case in the way that the case deserves. The Baltimore Police Department issued a ruling and maintained it. The city moved on. The Belvedere continued to stand at the corner of Charles and Chase, its beautiful old face unchanged, its basement room, that small locked, seldom visited space, presumably sealed and returned to whatever function it served before it became the endpoint of a man's life. The building does not remember. Buildings don't, but people do. The people who knew Ray Rivera remember him, vividly and specifically, and with the particular clarity that comes from loving someone genuinely. They remember his laugh and his attention and his warmth and his talent. They remember what it was like to be in a room with him, to have his full, genuine, unhurried focus turned toward you. They remember what it felt like to have that presence in the world. And they remember what it felt like when it was gone. That memory, the specific, indelible memory of a person who was here and then was not, is what drives the ongoing search for truth in this case. Not obsession, not the inability to accept loss, but the refusal to accept a false account of how that loss happened. The insistence that the story of a person's death, when it is told wrong, deserves to be corrected. Ray Rivera deserves the correct story of his death. Allison Rivera deserves the truth, and the world, our world, which has a stake in whether its institutions tell the truth about the deaths of the people who live in it, deserves better than the inadequate, insufficiently supported ruling that has stood as the official account of what happened to Ray Rivera for nearly 20 years. Ray Rivera was 32 years old. He was kind, talented, and deeply loved. He left his home one spring evening in Baltimore wearing flip-flops, expecting to return. He never did. His body was found 11 days later in a locked basement room inside the Belvedere Hotel, through a hole in a wall, with an unfinished text message on his phone addressed to the woman he loved. The police called it suicide. Allison never believed them. And after nearly 20 years of asking questions, examining evidence, and refusing to let her husband's story be told wrong, she is still standing, still searching, still insisting that the truth exists somewhere and deserves to be found. She is right. The physical evidence does not support the official ruling. The geometry doesn't work. The behavioral evidence doesn't fit. The flip-flops, the missing note, the unfinished message, the absence of any sign that Ray Rivera wanted to leave this world. None of it points where the ruling says it points. Something happened to Ray that night. Something that brought him to that building, to that rooftop, to that final desperate reach for his phone. Something that has never been named, never been proven, never been brought into the light where it belongs. Maybe it never will be. That is the hardest truth of cases like this one. That sometimes the answers stay buried. That sometimes the people who know what happened carry that knowledge to their graves. That sometimes the machinery of justice moves too slowly, or too carelessly, and the window closes before the truth can get through it. But maybe it won't stay buried. Maybe someone who has been carrying this for 20 years will finally decide that the weight is too much. Maybe a piece of evidence will surface. Maybe a conversation will happen that changes everything. Ray Rivera deserves that. Until then, we remember him. We say his name. We refuse to let the inadequate official account stand as the final word on who he was and how he left this world. He was not a statistic. He was not a ruling. He was a man, warm and creative and fully alive, who deserved every year that was taken from him. Good night, Ray. Thank you for listening tonight. If this case stayed with you, leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It means more than you know. Good night, everyone.